Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, and hello, everybody. Thanks a lot for this opportunity because, yes, I mean, climate and energy is not climate, but energy represents 2/3 of the CO2 emissions. So I do think there is really an interest in looking more specifically into the energy topic. Let me share my presentation with you. Sorry, I don't know. I don't know for which reason I cannot share it. Can you allow me to share your presentation or? Oh, now I can.
I think you should be able.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
it's fine.
Perfect.
My fault.
No worries.
That's when you work on too many things in parallel.
Yeah, we all know about it. Yeah, it's working perfectly.
Okay, excellent. So from my side, I will have a deeper look into the role of renewable energy and especially renewables in time of transition. And I do think, obviously, with COVID, we're talking about another transition than even a couple of weeks ago. Just maybe very quickly on who Renton One is. So I'm the executive director of Renton One, and Renton One is the renewable energy policy network for the 21st century. And Renton One is actually the only global renewable energy community which brings together players not only from one stakeholder group, but from different backgrounds and perspectives. These are players from science and academia, from governments, from industry, and from NGOs. And the community plus these different backgrounds really make the DNA of Renton One. So it is like a collaborative approach. And I think that's also why it's super interesting to have this opportunity to present here, because we're clearly also seeing the role young professional and future decision makers play in driving the transition. So it's really interesting to also discuss how you can engage with Renton One. That's one approach, is really the community. And the other one is really this bringing together of different perspectives is more messy to some extent, but ultimately stronger if we manage to have these players align and work together in one direction. Now, what are we doing? Very quickly, I think there are 3 pillars of Renton One. One is a community, as I mentioned before, but then we have one pillar, which is knowledge, and the other one, which is debates and communication. On the knowledge part, we're working again in a collaborative way. So we're producing collaborative knowledge analysis, which is shared together, but which is used to really inform decision makers to move to renewable energy and renewable energy based system now. When we're talking about the renewable energy based system, there are 3 pillars. One is obviously the reduction of the energy demand, so efficiency. That's not our focus, but we see it as one of the main pillars. Another one, which is the renewable energy for the supply side, and another one, which is a strong integration between renewable energy and efficiency, but also between the supply sectors and the demand sector. So I'm not going into detail here, but I'll just show you some of the data of some of the reports we have and invite you to visit our website to look at them, but also to see how you can contribute. Because what is really interesting is we have a community of experts and players, I'd say, like from students to the International Energy Agency, who can actively contribute to these different activities. And it's a governance structure which is very decentralized, but is also strong with regard to this and allows us to have make very decentralized information or a non-consolidated information visible. Now, just very quickly, where do we stand? Yeah, I did not underline, but Renton One is a global network, so we don't have a specific focus on Europe. But yeah, I think the global situation is really interesting to take into account because we're still living in quite globalized world. Where do renewable energy stay today? So this is building on the Renewables Global States report, a report we produce every year. And the next edition will be launched in June. Basically, in 2017, modern renewable energy accounted for 10.6% of the final energy demand. So when we're considering, and this is excluding traditional biomass, which is still very common in developing and emerging economies, but also in the heat sector, even in Europe. So especially Eastern Europe, for instance, Southern Europe also. And we see, for instance, that with economic crisis, so in Greece, there was a shift again in the heating sector towards traditional biomass. The total global capacity in terms of installed capacities rose in 2018 by 8%. And this is in the power sector. And 181 gigawatts of renewable power additions have basically been installed in 2018. And we have the new numbers is approximately 200 gigawatt in 2019. So it's really raising. And it's very much pushed by solar photovoltaics and wind. So I'm not going into detail here, but I thought it's interesting to show the developments, because we do see that there is an exponential development here. So these are the solar photovoltaics capacity additions over the last 10 years. And what we clearly see is that this is a result of policy. So there was a vision and a strategy, a target, policy supporting the development of solar photovoltaics that really translated into the development of industries, technology innovation, market, and significant cost reductions. The reality today is that solar photovoltaics and wind are the least cost option when we're looking into renewable energy, when we're looking into power production, power capacities, and into power generation. And that is something which really changes the dynamics, because as a result, we see that today investing in solar photovoltaics and wind is a purely economic decision very often. Now, coming to the overall energy system, we see, however, that the drive of renewable energy has really mainly occurred in the power sector, so for the generation of electricity. However, the electricity consumption only represents 17% of the total final energy which we are consuming. And in the heating and cooling sector, which is more or less 50-50, the building sector and the industry sector, there is only a share of 10% of renewable energy, and in the transport sector only of 3%. And these are really sectors that have not evolved a lot. In the power sector, we have 26%, and the share has been rising significantly. There are two aspects to it, or two conclusions. One is really that because the electrification or electricity is a least cost option, the electrification of the heating sector and the transport sector is really occurring with the development of e-mobility, for instance. That is one aspect. But another one is also that it is very clear that we now need to replicate the success story of renewable energy on the electricity side in these other sectors. And this brings us clearly to the fact that strong policies are needed. And here we see basically an imbalance. When you're looking at the right side of the slide, you will see that there are 135 countries with regulatory renewable energy policies in the power sector, only 70 in the transport sector, and this is mainly to support biofuels, and only 20 in the heating and cooling sector. So here's already, there has been much attention to the power sector from the policy side, much fewer attention to transport and heating and cooling. And that is something which obviously translates into an imbalance here. So these end-use sectors need to be addressed in another way. Another aspect, however, is also that the transport and the heating and cooling sector highly depend on fossil fuel. And we do see here on the left side, and this is a very conservative number, it does not include the externalities, but this is the amount of fossil fuel subsidies which is still existing worldwide. And as a result, even though today renewable energy is a least cost option, there is an imbalance in the market. And I think that is obviously in COVID times and as a result of geopolitical tensions, let's say it nicely, the oil and gas price, the oil price in particular, went down significantly. And it is very clear that there needs to be a policy answer here to re-establish good and balanced market conditions. This slide only to show that fossil fuel subsidies are really still widespread. There are countries which are subsidizing them highly, but we do see there are 115 countries in 2017 that were still subsidizing fossil fuel subsidies. Now, I mentioned that policy policy support needs to occur, and very much at the national level. But we do see since a couple of years that the subnational level play an increasingly important role. So in the US, the state level is very, very important, but we also see that municipalities play a key role. And interestingly, municipalities can be, and we produced last year the first Renewables in Cities Global Status Report, which is a new report series that really looks into what is the situation in cities, the renewable energy situation in cities. And we see from the numbers we have, and this is obviously not all cities worldwide, but a trend and building on self-reporting data of cities. But we see here that the ambition, the city targets are often higher than the national targets. We also see that they are broader. So often they do not only look into the power sector, but also in heating, cooling, transport. And that 250 cities worldwide do have 100% renewable energy target or a renewable target. What is clear from the data, however, there is partly not always a good understanding of the difference between electricity and energy. And there needs to be clearly an improvement of the data, but also of the knowledge and awareness of what the energy transition really encompasses at the city level. So there is a big difference from one city to the other. The cities do not only have a policy maker role. They do have the possibility in their municipal operations. They are basically energy consumers. So here they can decide to shift to renewable energy. But interestingly, and I think this is really a real game changer renewable energy represents, renewable energy allows in a decentralized generation approach for new players to become active players of the energy transition. Because as a citizen, you can decide to produce your own energy. As a municipality, you can decide to do so. As private sector company, industry, etc., you can do so, provided the regulator framework allows you to do this. And this is really something where we're changing from the sole energy consumer to a role of an energy consumer and possibly also an energy producer. Cities do also have another role, which is really inspiring citywide actors, and that is they have a pioneering function. So moving their services, moving the public transfer to renewable energy, to renewable-based e-mobility, to biogas is something which really has very strong impact and can inspire. And they can, however, also at the municipal level, set regulator framework that, for instance, make solar thermal or renewable energy in buildings mandatory. And we have seen in the past that this also, or in some cases, we see that cities are even often inspiring the national framework. So if we take the case of Barcelona, Barcelona made, for instance, solar thermal in buildings mandatory, and has the national framework has really built on the Barcelona experience. Another development, and I think that is something which is really interesting too. Sorry, I'm coming back to the slide before. There is, since a couple of years, a change with regard to this. In the past, national policies was the center. We see, however, that municipalities can also provide complementary frameworks and have policies and regulatory frameworks at their level, but they also can influence the national policies. Another player, and I think we heard it in the presentation before also, citizens have raised their voice more and more. And in positive and negative ways, I guess, when it comes to the energy transition. But this really showed that citizens can also force government to step up. And we heard it, I mean, before again on the airlines. Yes, it is really important also in these days to see like how as citizens we can influence decisions taken by policymakers, how to raise our voice here. Very clearly the Friday for Future, especially in Europe, has been, not in all European countries, to be honest. I mean, I'm based in Paris, and I'd say like compared to Brussels, for instance, we had very few people on the street. But well, in general, I think there has been internationally a really strong movement from that side that has really created other dynamics at the government level. When we take the case of Germany, for instance, and you see it on the right side, there has been a very strong push against wind farms. So the "not in my backyard" is also a voice which is there and has a strong influence on regulation. So for instance, in Germany, in 2 states, the distances to wind generation has been increased, with the result that I do think that in these regions, 70% of the potential locations have been cannot be realized anymore in terms of wind projects. And that obviously has a major influence on the possibilities to develop renewable energy. And then the picture below is the situation in Chile. I think there is an increasing demand for inclusion. And again, I'm not saying that renewable energy is the answer for all of this, but with the governance and the decentralization and the possibility to bring other players to the table, developing community energy, but also having the situation that that basically developing renewable energy creates local jobs, creates local income. There is really renewable energy can be part of the answer. Another group of players that really influence the development of renewable energy is also investors. And I will not go into detail here on the development of investments over the years, but to just highlight 2 aspects. One aspect is that basically the cost went down so significantly that today in the power sector, for instance, there is more investment in power generation, new power generation capacities from renewable energy than from fossil fuel. But that in most of the locations, it's also more economic to invest in new renewable power capacity than continuing to operate fossil fuel-based capacities. And that is something which is a real game changer. And that is also something, so cost is clearly one of the drivers when we're looking into the investment from private sector. So we see a huge increase of power purchase agreements by private sector. We see an uptake of many private players and industries to engage into 100% renewable energy target or 100% renewable electricity targets. And another aspect too is that we see that some investors and insurances really assess the risk linked to fossil fuel in a different way than before because of climate reasons and because of the resilience of renewable energy to climate change. And as a result, there is clearly a development of the divestment of fossil fuel. And I would not say that it's already generalized, but we see, for instance, that the power purchase agreements have increased by over 40% from 2019 over 2018, and that is really encouraging. So what are the success factors to drive change to renewables? Clearly that there are many new and diverse individuals and organizations, players outside of the energy ecosystem that need to be included, but that can be included. It's also clear that it means to some extent disruption. It also means leaving our comfort zones, building bridges between sectors. So not always speaking the same language. So today, I'd say like in the beginning, it was really like renewable energy players talking to themselves. Today, it is about bringing renewable energy to cities and bringing cities to renewable energy debate, bringing renewable energy into the industry sector, into agriculture, into transport, and bringing these players also to the global energy debates and the tables. And it's very clear that it's about bringing governments together with businesses, NGOs, local players, and citizens. Now, a new challenge here is clearly that not everybody is driven by the energy transition or renewable energy. And here it's really interesting to see the value renewable energy has. And it contributes to clean air and a healthy environment. And I think especially in the COVID time, that is really a very, very strong argument. It contributes to less CO2 emissions. It contributes to economic opportunities. And I'll just, we had a communication workshop yesterday and I had this example and I found it really interesting. Tesla has decided in Germany to build a green giga production facilities for the new Tesla in Brandenburg, which is an economic weak region, and which is also a region which is affected by the coal phase out. And one of the decisive arguments there was the high renewable energy share in the electricity mix of the region, because they are a strong renewable energy producer. And that, so in these cases show that renewable energy become an economic advantage, can attract industry. And for instance, in this case, it is planned, I think was something like a 4 million investment and 3,000 to 7,000 jobs. So there are clear economic opportunities that are local jobs. When we're talking about renewables in heating, for instance, that's always local jobs. Decent jobs, then affordable and inclusive energy, and that is really something which is extremely important in developing countries, and also energy security and sovereignty. And I think here it is clear that we need to understand the values renewable energy bring, because it also allows to make it more relevant to decision makers, basically outside of the renewable energy sphere. Now, very quickly, and I think it's almost the last slide, what does this mean, renewables in times of COVID? Obviously, there are also, because of the economic crisis, there are some negative impacts. And we do see that, for instance, photovoltaics has been affected in a different way because much of the supply comes from China than wind. But all in all, there are interesting aspects here and there are real opportunities. The decline in global demand due to COVID has shown two things. One is that this decline, which can be representative for energy efficiency measures also in normal times, has led to the fact that in many grids, we have a high share of renewable electricity in the grids, up to 85%. And this really showed that these pillars of efficiency and renewables are feasible. And this is something which is still, some countries still believe that we cannot integrate high shares of variable renewable electricity in the grids. So we now have a reference point to show that it is possible. Obviously, it had impact on global CO2 emissions and air pollution levels. And this is really a major health impact. It's a climate impact, and renewable energy can contribute to keep them at these levels we currently have. And then we do see that the collapse of the oil price in markets. And I think here, for me, it's really important to underline that this is not only COVID. It shows again how governance and politics have a major influence, how wrong technology decisions have long-term impacts on the markets. But the low oil price obviously means that if there is not the right policy answer, and we all need to ensure that there is the right policy answer, renewable energy will need to compete with lower fossil fuel prices. The other aspect is obviously that energy is an essential service, also a health service. But when we're looking in particular also in developing countries, access to energy is important. Access to energy means access to water to some extent, education, economic activities, etc. So it's fundamental. And another aspect, and I think here in Europe, we're really in a geographic space where, and also political space where there is a good understanding. If we do not combine the climate strategies with the economic recovery, there will not be enough money to do the necessary investments. And I think the development of the green recovery discussion, conditionality and bailout, etc., is really fundamental, and we need to make sure that this happens. Then the other part, renewable energy, clearly as a decentralized energy system, allows to ensure a resilience of the energy system when it comes to a resilience, but also a sovereignty and a security, which is fundamental if we think about climate change impacts. So I'll end on the slide. Oh no, sorry. I see that I have a quick concluding slide, but I really invite you to join the Rent-to-Own community, because we're 2,000 players, more or less, contributing to the data, and there is really a lot of space for young professionals to join. So please be in touch. And just in conclusion, how to take advantage of the opportunities today. We clearly need to drive the renewable energy development beyond power, so in all energy sectors. The policy and regulatory frameworks are fundamental, and they need to be aligned across all the national, subnational, and local level, but they can be influenced by citizens, by municipalities, and by industry. And that is really something which I think is very, very important. We all have a responsibility to go in the right direction. Renewable energy allows, empowers basically these players also to get involved. And as I underlined, drivers to push for renewable energy are various. I mean, there are many of them, and it's very important to have these in mind, because it allows to better understand how to make renewable energy relevant to the different decision makers that need to be on board when driving the decision. And in COVID times, obviously, sustainable energy is key in the green recovery and needs to be part of this. And from Rent-to-Own side, what we do see and what we're really trying to do is to provide better data and stronger communication to inform decision makers in all relevant sectors. We still see that there is little data existing. For the moment, there is not yet a tracking of what happens, for instance, on the recovery packages. And that is something which will be fundamental to track. Thank you very much. If there are questions, I'm happy to answer these.
Thank you so much, Rana. That was, as some of our listeners are writing on the YouTube comments, that was a very nice presentation, super informative. And that I'm sure it's also sparking debates in the teams. And first of all, thank you so much also for your open invite. I think it's really nice that you're opening this community to young professionals, so the invite is very well received. I wanted to maybe read one of the questions that we are receiving from the speakers, because obviously you talk for the needs of engaging with policymakers on one side, so that the regulatory framework actually becomes something actionable and useful. But someone is also asking, when you speak about citizen engagement, so on the other hand, what do you believe are the most powerful tools at reach of the common citizen to impact on the future and or current energy system? So from a citizen perspective, what's the next move we should take?
So I do think there are probably two key leverages, but which are interesting to understand because we can build on these. One is we're consumers, so we can take decisions as consumers. And since you're all in Europe, I think in Europe we have the advantage that, for instance, we can, or most of you are in Europe, but we have the advantage that there is a liberalized energy market and renewable energy providers. So here is clearly a possibility to change your energy provider. And if you cannot decide it yourself, but you have your family around you, then convince your family and convince your friends and convince your grandparents, etc. I mean, I think this is really something which is sending a very strong signal. and empowering other players. There is obviously the other part, which is becoming even more active, and that is investing in community energy and citizens' energy. And that is something where we clearly see there is in Europe, there is a drive with regard to this. But also, and I think at the local level, there is so in your working environment, because it's not only at home, but also in your working environment, contribute and make sure that there are sustainable energy or sustainability criteria that are also implemented in basically the companies you're working at, or in the universities. I mean, all these players can take action in terms of energy consumers. That's one aspect. The other one is, however, and I found it really interesting, the Ministry of Economics, a representative there had, when the Friday for Future demonstration started, they referred to the fact that these developments and movements gave them as policymakers the legitimacy to take political decisions which are not always supported by all players. And I do think this is really something which is really, really strong. If we don't raise this voice, then it's much easier for policymakers to hide behind the lobbies. And I do think that here there is something which is super interesting. And when we're looking into, and I'm not saying this as Rentin One, but I'm saying this as Rana. But when you're looking into basically revolutions, or in Eastern Europe, or now in Northern Africa, etc., the link between the young generation and the grandparents is really strong. For two reasons. The grandparents don't have the same things to lose anymore, but they are voters and they are taxpayers, and they can decide where to invest, and they're interested to give their money to the following generations. And here we see, and this is something which is not so developed yet, but that you have the Fridays for Future, but also grandparents for futures. I think this alignment is really interesting. And then it's also a reality that you might have, you see, other generations that are part in, that have, are stockholders of fossil fuel industry or other players, and can also drive decisions of big players and make a shift here. So I think it's really about always see that the own action does have an influence on the system, because you can multiply it. So raise your voice and get engaged.
Thanks so much for the encouragement, and let's hope that this multiplier effect will work with this event. I think we are off for a good start. And yeah, I think it's time to close it off. Unfortunately, we would love to stay here for all the evening with all our speakers, but the teams also need to start actually working on their challenges. And we know that some of them are already scheduling the first feedback sessions with their coaches. So there is a lot of work to do. But I'm sure that the whole afternoon session was super helpful to give them some context and some inspiration about future reflections. So I really want to thank you all. So Rana for your speech, but also all the previous speakers, Marine and Agostino that came before, as well as Victor. And yes, I mean, let's hope that this event takes us where in the best direction possible. And we will have 2 more expert speakers tomorrow. So if you just follow with the announcement that we're making on social media, then you will stay up to date. So also for participants that are not part of the Climathon, they are completely welcome to follow the next sessions that will happen with the same format. So thanks so much to everyone, and I think
thanks for the invitation, and good luck.
Thanks
good
so
work.
Much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.